big discussed worldwide, really, as this footage has emerged. Horror footage, according to one news outlet, the Daily Mail, says it's a wounded Palestinian strapped to the hood of an IDF Israeli army jeep during an arrest raid in the West Bank city of Jenin in Israel. Israeli Defense Forces, sorry, the West Bank, I should say, in the disputed territories there. IDF confirming on Saturday that it was captured on video, widely shared on social media. The IDF has said this absolutely does not conform to their values. What's been the reaction and the explanation as to why this has happened, Zach?
Well, the IDF says that this conduct, quote, is seen in the video not consistent with the IDF's orders and what is expected of its soldiers, adding that the incident is being investigated and will be dealt with accordingly. One of the questions I have in that I haven't had a response to yet at this point in the afternoon is what unit is this? Because in the West Bank, there have been human rights abuses and some awful moments over the last decade at the hands of Israeli troops. There's been in the same exact area outside Jenin, there's been instances of Israeli troops torturing Palestinians prior to their detainment or being detained with no clear reason for days at a time. There's, of course, that famous 60 Minutes report in this same area where the Israeli troops go into the home and somewhat evict a family of children and women and never give an explanation as the TV cameras arrive into this area. The troops shut the door and the family's left out and they don't have any idea what's going on. So this is a really controversial area anyways. And the reason why I want to understand what unit this was is because the Netze Yehuda battalion is the religious wing of the IDF that serves the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi soldiers. And they have been the ones that have been pinned for a lot of these abuses. They operate in the West Bank. Since the Gaza war has broken out, the movement of the IDF and where they usually are and where they usually go has changed quite a bit. The Netze Yehuda battalion has been in Gaza over the last 8 months. And there's been some questions as to whether they're going to go back into the West Bank or be allowed to go back into the West Bank because they've been sanctioned by the U.S. State Department as well. So what's remarkable, Peter, about this video, I mean, as you look at it, you initially I thought, wow, they strapped the body of a dead man that they had killed. And then you see him move. And you think,
Mm-hmm.
what in the world is taking place here? Where they have got an injured man who's been shot. And you can see there's also some sort of bloodied some sort of cloth that looks like it would go over where the license plate is, but there's no license plate on these vehicles, these military vehicles, anyways. But there's something else strapped to the grill as well that's got blood all over it. So just a bizarre incident
Yeah.
that's taking place here. And if you're really in a firefight, the amount of time that it takes to strap a man to the bonnet, to the hood of this car, of this military vehicle, it looks like it would have had to have taken some time. And it also looks like he's not entirely strapped down, that he has
Yeah.
one arm free as well. Just a bizarre video.
Let's talk about something else that's happening in the Middle East, and that is the fragility of the government and the very difficult political time that Benjamin Netanyahu is having, and tens of thousands of Israelis, in fact, reports of 150,000 people, protesting in Tel Aviv, demanding a Gaza ceasefire deal and the return of hostages held by Hamas terrorists, and also many anti-Netanyahu people there as well. This is an absolutely huge protest last night in Tel Aviv. Just tell us about that.
Yeah, this is a continuation of what they're calling a week of disruption, or in Hebrew, another translation could also be a week of resistance. They've been calling for elections. They've been calling for an end to Netanyahu's government, and they've been doing this all over the country. A lot of the protests over the course of this conflict have been in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv. But now you're starting to see protests in some of these communities that were affected on October 7th as
Mm.
people were returning. So some of these areas where the massacre took place, there's also survivors that I met when I was in Ashkelon 2 nights ago. A woman who was in one of the mashavs, which is another community like a kibbutz, and 20 of the residents of that mashav were killed, her friends, her neighbors, and she lived through that incident because she hid for hours and hours until
Unimaginable.
help came.
Horrendous.
It's unbelievable. And as she was telling me this too, it was incredibly emotional. It was so difficult to hear her describe some of the things that she lived through. And then you see her where she is, that she's at this protest. And I say, well, why are you here today? And she goes, well, Netanyahu abandoned us. And you know what? I understand the politics. I understand the things that need to have to happen in a war, in a wartime setting. But she's so adamant. She said he was there on October 7th. He was the one that was supposed to protect us. And all of the leaders I have been able to forgive because they've come forward, and the IDF officials have said this was our failure. We apologize. This was something that that was our failure at that fence, that letting them through was on us. But Netanyahu is yet to take responsibility and says until the end of the war, we'll have an investigation and we'll know who, deserves the blame. And to people that lived through October 7th, that a lot of for them, many of them, that's just unacceptable. They can't just they have to have a leader who accepts responsibility in those times and doesn't just kick the can down the road and say, well, I'm fighting a war here. I
Yeah.
can't concern myself with these things.
And there's a hostage as well, a former hostage. I'm going to get the pronunciation of this wrong. Alana Grzycki spoke at the rally last night, revealing she felt betrayed by the government. She said, not a single minister bothered to call and ask about my well-being. I was good enough to sit in the tunnels, but not enough to meet with a government minister. Netanyahu said the demonstrations strengthen Hamas, but they actually weaken Netanyahu. And that's a really powerful thing to say anyway, but certainly coming from a former hostage. And there are so many conflicted emotions here. And I think this is, to me anyway, Zach, as someone sitting in London with not a percentage of the knowledge that you have about this, but nonetheless, it seems to me that it reminds us that Israel is a democracy, that there are so many people who have so many differing opinions and conflicted emotions around this as well. It is not a one-party state. Netanyahu, many people see him as a dictator, but he's not. He's vulnerable, actually, politically. What do you think happens? Can you see an election happening this year, perhaps, in Israel?
He's vulnerable, but he's smart and he knows how to hold on to power and how to hold on to his coalition. Yeah, remember, he came back into power too while he was under investigation for corruption charges and has been these protests that we see in Tel Aviv, they're about returning the hostages now, but we saw similar sizes before the war against the Netanyahu government for those decisions to make changes to the Supreme Court. So it's a uneven ground that he's on, but he's familiar with that territory.
Yeah,
And so he
yeah.
knows how to hold that coalition. But
And you
at
never
that same
underestimate
time,
him, do you?
no, you really can't. And that's really that's something that people out on the streets know and talk about, and that's part of the reason why there's so much disgust for him, and in particular, is they feel like he's always got another trick up his sleeve. He's always got a way to stay in office, stay in power.
Mm.
To them, though, there's now a growing sentiment and a feeling too amongst everyday Israelis, even those that don't really concern themselves with politics, that this war, especially in the north with Hezbollah, that this is going to outlast the effects of this war are going to outlast this current administration,
Yeah.
and that somebody else is going to have to be prime minister someday besides Netanyahu, and somebody's going to be taking over these issues. And there's also a lot of talk about, there's been some major moments around the world, even outside of Israel. You look at major moments that happen at the change of presidencies in America. The hostage crisis with Iran ends the day that Ronald Reagan is sworn in as
Yeah,
president.
yeah, yeah.
And there's a lot of moments where you can get things done, even in the transition period to new leadership. And sometimes it's the new leadership that sparks
Yeah.
the change that you need. So there's a lot of Israelis talking about that, about, Benny Gantz, if he comes into power, it's not like you have to start from square one and
Yeah,
restart the
yeah, yeah.
war. And, there can be progress here.
And it could be
And
very
even some of the
interesting.
moderate Israelis, yeah, they understand that.
Yeah, Zach, very, very interesting. And it could also be very interesting with Gantz having been part of that war cabinet and then resigned. Loads to talk about. I could talk to you all day about this, but listen, thank you. Zach Anders is a journalist who has been based mostly in Israel. He's in London at the moment, but he's going back there very soon.